Russia's hackers disrupt a U.S. election.
Democracy itself is an infrastructure. What we saw was an attack on our country.
And America plans on striking back.
When it comes to interfering in our election, we better be ready to throw rocks.
A new conflict emerges.
They need each other as enemies more than they need each other as friends, unfortunately.
Has the battle now moved beyond cyberspace? I'm on my way to a small town in Lithuania, where the rising tensions between Russia and the West are playing out on the ground. This was once part of the Soviet Union, but today, it's a NATO country. And the Western military alliance is flexing its muscles. German troops and tanks are rolling through the country for the first time since World War II. It's a scene heavy with symbolism.
So as you can see behind me, these are German tanks being deployed into Lithuania, which is part of a larger NATO plan to offset Russian aggression in Eastern Europe.
And that aggression includes targeted cyber warfare. The Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, are three former Soviet republics that became full members of NATO. They joined other East Bloc nations that aligned themselves with the West after the Cold War ended. Today, many of these countries find themselves in the crosshairs of Russian cyber attacks. But the biggest job that Putin's hackers ever pulled off was during the 2016 US election, where they sowed doubt in the entire democratic process. To intelligence officials, the hacks and leaks were classic Russian tradecraft. But to the powers on Capitol Hill, it was a serious wake-up call. Amy Klobuchar is on the US Senate committee that oversees federal elections. She was also part of a bipartisan Senate delegation that visited the Baltics after the November vote.
When did you go to Eastern Europe?
Well, we left the day after Christmas, and based on the trip that I just took, this is nothing new. Those Baltic states have heard this record before. You think about Estonia. Russia got mad, they cyber hacked them and shut down their internet service. Lithuania invited members of the Ukrainian parliament from the Crimean area, that's the area that Russia has annexed. What happens to Lithuania? Many, many attempts to hack into their accounts and to go after them. This is not just one incident and one political presidential candidate and one political party or even one country. This is a modus operandi that they have used across the world.
The hacking is particularly aggressive in countries that were traditionally inside Russia's sphere of influence. And now NATO is trying to find ways to combat it.
So this is the NATO Strategic Communications Center in Riga, Latvia, where they're studying Russian information warfare.
One of the missions of this center is to help NATO countries resist Russian propaganda, social media, and disinformation campaigns. Jānis Sārts is a former Latvian State Secretary of Defense and was responsible for the country's cybersecurity policies.
So this is the Russian information warfare doctrine, the actual document.
Yes, it is, and it was written by General Gerasimov.
Valery Gerasimov is a powerful and influential general, and the man behind the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. It reveals his view of the future of war.
From their perspective, there's a constant information confrontation, information warfare ongoing.
The doctrine basically outlines the methods and strategies Russia should use to achieve its geopolitical goals. Interestingly, 3/4 of those strategies are non-military. Things like imposing economic sanctions or organizing political opposition. Information warfare, weakening a rival through hacking, propaganda, and disinformation, is the only strategy straddling the line between military and non-military. And it's the only constant in times of both war and peace.
So for Russia, we're in a constant state, a permanent state of information war.
Yes, well, that's not me here, General Gerasimov.
Now, would you say this came from the Soviet era? Is this an old Cold War playbook, so to speak?
It's an old KGB technique that has been developed in 70s and 80s. The difference is now the internet, social media platforms allow much easier use and much bigger application. So it's actually a multiplier, more or less. But the tool in itself is an old-fashioned one.
Now, is this a case of Russia and Russians being particularly good at this kind of warfare, or is this a case of the West being weak and there's something being exploited?
Well, that's what they want to say, that West is weak. I wouldn't agree with that. We've not been paying attention. That is true. We've thought that this is behind us. That is true. And they've been sort of picking it up. And I would argue they probably think that's one of their most effective tools at their disposal currently, because in all other areas, either economy, infrastructure, military capability, they're far behind. Probably the notion of trying to target election process with these techniques is something different, hoping to make a much more profound effect, a game changer.
And in the eyes of politicians and pundits in the US, Russia's interference in the 2016 election did change the game. But what I need to understand is, how does this all help Vladimir Putin? Once US officials concluded Russia interfered in the presidential election, you can be sure they started plotting their response. But I'd like to know how far an escalating cyber war between these two former Cold War rivals could go. I'm in Moscow trying to get some official answers, but so far I've been shut out. So instead of waiting around for a formal sit-down, I just showed up at Russia's lower house of parliament, the State Duma, to corner an official.
So we're crashing a party in the Russian State Duma right now, seeing if anybody will talk to us about DNC.
Inside the chamber, the scene is pretty formal. Politicians and military men waxing poetic. Rule 1 of an effective disinformation campaign is never talk about your disinformation campaign. Meet General Vladimir Shamanov. He's the chairman of the powerful State Duma Defense Committee. Shamanov was once commander-in-chief of all of Russia's airborne troops, but he might be better known for human rights abuses that happened under his command in Chechnya. I was hoping he could talk to me about the next moves in the conflict between the US and Russia. He agreed to talk, but first, this awkward elevator ride with a man human rights groups want investigated for alleged war crimes.
So how should the Russian government respond to the American government's accusation that the Russian government's meddled with its election, its presidential election?
Значит, никаких конкретных доказательств убедительно нам никто не предъявил. И поэтому, если говорить чисто профессионально, то нет никакой необходимости на эти процессы влиять, потому что если бы было вмешательство, то были конкретные доказательства.
Now, you say there's no proof, but the international community, American intelligence, and just about anybody else who knows anything about cybersecurity knows Russia did it. Why is the Russian government and Vladimir Putin so hesitant to say that they were in fact the ones that were influencing the election?
Поэтому меня вот удивляет ваша настойчивость. Я же русским языком ответил. Россия никаких мер вмешательства в выборы американского народа не предпринимала, уважая суверенитет американского государства.
Now, do you think that there's any chance that relations will improve under Trump with Russia?
Мы, к сожалению, 8 лет при господине Обаме потеряли и оцениваем эти 8 лет как самый низкий уровень взаимоотношений наших двух государств.
While Shamanov denies any Russian interference in the US election, he did admit the country is actively expanding its cyber warfare capabilities. In fact, days earlier, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu revealed that Russia has trained and activated highly effective information troops. And it's pretty safe to assume that they're targeting NATO. And that's something that puts a lot of Western democracies on edge. But covert war on NATO is music to the ears of Alexander Dugin, a political philosopher with close ties to the Russian elite, who's been dubbed Putin's Rasputin. He's one of Russia's leading voices against globalization, the economic, political, and cultural integration of the world that's driven by international trade. Some Russians see that system as a threat, and it could be one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin wanted to help Donald Trump get elected.
Why are you happy with this man being the president of the US?
Because I think that the world is approaching a catastrophe of globalization, because it's based on the presumption that everybody in the world as individual are completely equal, and the humanity should be treated as a consumer's body. President Obama and all previous presidents completely engaged in globalization process. That is the reason why Putin is so demonized at the West, because his agenda to reaffirm Russia as regional power went exactly against this process of globalization. So Trump is alternative to all that. Trump is the last chance of conservative part of humanity to change this direction.
Dugin's idea that a Trump victory would mean a freer hand for Russia didn't come out of nowhere. And the incoming president confirmed as much, promising a drastic change in American foreign policy.
We will seek friendship and goodwill with the nations of the world, but we do so with the understanding that it is the right of all nations to put their own interests first. We do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone.
This slogan, "Let's make America great again," everybody in the world outside is invited to make Russia great again, to make Europe great again, to make Israel great again. Everybody is free to repeat the example for Donald Trump. If we, for example, could expand our influence outside of Russia, we will be free to do so.
Meanwhile, Dugin believes that both NATO and the European Union are doomed to fail. And though he hopes Trump will usher in this new world order, he denies that Russia's hacking helped put him in office.
We did nothing, except we prayed for Trump, we dreamed of Trump, we wished the victory of Trump. Maybe some of our hackers not only prayed and dreamed, but as well intervened. But I think it's what on the small scale, maybe they could affect 3 or 4 waters.
But for Russia specifically, is the rise of Trump, the dissolution of NATO, the dissolution of the EU, is this all a good thing?
Yes, I think that is a kind of event that is strictly linked to the victory of Donald Trump. Thank you, Donald Trump.
Alexander Dugin believes that a Trump presidency is good for Russia. But there may be another reason Putin got involved in a US election: payback. There are plenty of reasons why the Russian government would launch a hacking campaign to support Donald Trump over his rival, Hillary Clinton. But for ordinary Russians, there was more to it than that. Matt Taibbi is a journalist who covered the Trump campaign for Rolling Stone, and he lived and worked in Russia for more than a decade in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War.
So has the US ever meddled in a Russian election before?
Of course they have. I was there when they did it. I lived in Russia in 1996. We more or less openly meddled in Boris Yeltsin's re-election campaign in 1996. We bragged about it in the cover of Time magazine. If you go back and look, in July of 1996, there's a big picture of Boris Yeltsin, and the headline is "Yanks to the Rescue." It was an extraordinarily sophisticated operation that they pulled off. Yeltsin was going to lose that election. If you looked at it a year out, the communist Gennady Zyuganov was way up in the polls. He was going to win. And Yeltsin had this tremendous unpopularity problem. And that's when there's this series of events, and America was in the middle of all of them. They gathered together all the future oligarchs. It's clearly a deal where they're going to be the recipients of this massive privatization program. It's a quid pro quo. We're going to give you these oil companies. You, in turn, are going to give Boris Yeltsin campaign contributions. He's going to flood the air with commercials. He's going to win the election, and then he's going to turn over political power to you, right? And we're going to bring over Americans to help organize the campaign. For Russians, when I bring this stuff up, they laugh at me like, yeah, don't you remember what you guys did in '96? And you expect us to feel guilty about this stuff? I mean, come on.
Russians might think interfering in the 2016 US election was an acceptable move in an established game. But for many Americans, it was breaking the rules. And in political circles, the extent of Russia's interference was a call to action.
We can have all the technology, all the tanks, all the people, but if we're not fighting the next war, we're in trouble. And cyber is the next war.
Angus King is an independent senator from Maine and a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was also co-sponsor of the Cyber Active War Act of 2016.
How do you define a cyber attack? And how do you define a cyber act of war?
And the answer is, we have to do it. We haven't yet.
And how do you respond to meddling in the nation's most important leadership decision?
I would argue that democracy itself is an infrastructure, and that what we saw was an attack on our country. Just as if they had dropped paratroopers into Washington and took out the computers under their arms and went down the Potomac River in a submarine. And I'm not prepared here today to say what the strategy should be, but I am prepared to say we sure as hell need one. And it needs to be clear, and it needs to be understood by our adversaries so that it is a deterrent for them acting. And deterrence, by the way, only works if the other guys know it. You've got to tell them, this is what we consider an act of war.
Or you have to saber rattle.
Or yeah, but it has to be real. They have to understand that there are going to be consequences. And so far, it's, we'll respond at a time and place of our choosing. One of the principles of cyber deterrence, it seems to me, is that it has to happen fast. It has to be not automatic, but within hours of the attack, not within days. The longer you wait, the less effect that it has. I met last fall with representatives of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And they were describing that what we had seen here was absolutely routine to them. And it's multifaceted. It's not only hacking, but it's disinformation, fake news, all of that kind of thing, planning salacious stories about Moscow's opponents, whatever. This is their whole strategy. Putin has found a brilliant way to undermine the West on the cheap. He doesn't have to send in tanks and troops and bombers, but he's wreaking havoc in Western democracies. For the price of one F-35 airplane, the Russians can hire 5,000 hackers.
Senator King is looking for a cyber strategy to deter Russian online aggression, but some in the intelligence community think they already have the answer. Russia's cyber attacks during the 2016 election might have been a turning point in US-Russia relations. Or maybe it was more like a returning point. Michael Hayden is a Cold War veteran who's the former head of both the CIA and the NSA. He's got some pretty specific ideas about what the Russians did and what the US could do next.
What point is something like that hack, which influenced, for all intents and purposes, potentially got a president elected, that
an unknowable fact.
An unknowable fact, but it seems as though that's the case, that could potentially bring ruin to the United States of America. Is that not an act of war in and of itself?
Act of war is a big word here, all right? We need to be careful, all right? You have this zone of peace, you have this zone of war, and then you've got this competitive environment in between the two.
Now let's talk about retaliation, because
response. Let me talk a little bit about response. The first thing, Ben, to keep in mind is this is not a cyber problem. This is a Russia problem. And once you've done that, Ben, your response then has a much wider range of possibilities that you could use to push back against the Russians, to actually point out to them, this is kind of unacceptable. Frankly, something I would really support is I would sell or give a whole range of defensive arms to the Ukrainians, something that we've refused to do. That gets their attention. If you want to do something in the cyber domain, the Russians just use a cyber espionage event to weaken American democracy, or try to weaken American democracy. All right, game on. We're going to use the cyber domain to weaken Russian autocracy. What do I mean? I mean pushing anonymizing tools as aggressively as possible into the Russian cyberspace to make it harder for the Russian security services to do their primary function, which is to watch other Russians.
But as the Americans weigh their options, some worry that an aggressive US response will lead in only one direction: escalation. Matt Taibbi sees the dangers.
Judging from your experiences living in Russia for so long and also seeing what's gone on in the last few years between Putin and Obama, how do you see that Russian-American relationship going forward now that we know that they did indeed intervene in a presidential election?
One of the things we were always cognizant of is that the military-industrial complexes of both countries missed each other after the Cold War ended because they had been enormously useful to each other financially. The idea of one being a threat to the other, that the expansion of NATO necessitated this enormous investment by the Russians, and likewise on the other side. And I think that's what we're going to see playing out now, that Russia and America are going to rediscover each other as enemies, and they're going to rediscover the utility of each other as enemies.
There's no way Trump and Putin are going to stay friends forever.
I don't think so. I just think that there's too much momentum in the direction of this sort of new Cold War for that to really last. Obviously, America and Russia do have common interests. They always have had common interests, and especially with global terrorism, ISIS, there are issues where it's actually beneficial for us to work together, but they need each other as enemies more than they need each other as friends, unfortunately. And they're going to, I would imagine, begin to divide up spheres of influence again, the same way they did before, and we're going to see a massive rearming campaign, and there's going to be a lot of money thrown at that, at espionage and weapons, and that's where I see it going.
As I witnessed in Lithuania, that rearming has already begun. And since the election, more and more cash has flowed into the military, both in Russia and the US. But it's hard to know where all this ends up and exactly how or if an information war launched in cyberspace will eventually play out on the ground.